The city outside was a blur of rain-soaked streets and towering glass skyscrapers, but inside the office it was cold. The hum of computers and the murmur of muted conversations barely filled the empty spaces of the high-rise. The bright fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, as if they too were growing tired of pretending that everything was fine. In the middle of it all, Kelly sat, unnoticed, behind a worn-out desk in the farthest corner of the bank. She had no windows to look out of, no high-profile meetings to attend, and no one to answer to, yet she was the most powerful person in the building. But no one knew that. No one but her. She watched as her colleagues hustled past her, their hurried footsteps indifferent to her presence. No one cared to know her name. They saw only a black woman, an invisible worker among the many faces of the office. Her role, her purpose, none of it mattered to them. To them, she was a faceless employee in a sea of forgotten, expendable bodies. A cleaner, a backup, nothing more. But beneath the surface, Kelly wasn't just another worker. She was the lifeblood of the company, the one who kept everything running smoothly from behind the scenes, the one whose decisions echoed throughout the corporation like a ghost in the system, shifting the tides without ever being noticed. And it was all about to change. Her phone buzzed on the desk, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Without a second thought, Kelly answered. "Hello." Her voice was steady, calm, though her eyes never left the screen in front of her. "Kelly, right?" The voice on the other end was brisk, condescending. It belonged to Victor, the new bank manager who had arrived just a few weeks ago with all the arrogance and self-assurance that came with being the latest in a long line of self-proclaimed saviors of the company. "Yeah, this is Kelly," she replied, her tone unchanged. "Great. I need those reports on my desk now. I don't want to have to remind you again," he snapped. Kelly could hear the clatter of keyboards in the background, the shuffle of papers, a rush to prove his dominance. A new boss, fresh from the boardroom, eager to prove that he was going to turn things around. She could already tell what kind of man he was. But what he didn't know was that Kelly had already seen every corner of this place. She knew the numbers better than anyone, understood the people better than anyone, and had been quietly pulling the strings of this machine long before he ever stepped foot inside the building. "Of course, Victor," Kelly replied, her voice like silk, barely a flicker of emotion betraying her inner thoughts. "I'll have them to you soon." She hung up before he could say another word, her face unreadable. Minutes passed in silence as she continued to type away, but her mind was far from the task at hand. Victor had no idea who he was dealing with. No idea that Kelly was the one who owned the company, not in name, but in power. She was the one who had bought it, who had carefully built it from the ground up in the shadows, her face never known to the public or the employees. But now, as Victor continued to push her, insulting her, belittling her, Kelly felt the calmness in her rise to the surface like a storm, just beginning to stir. It had been a long time coming, and she knew that things were about to change. Victor, with all his self-importance, was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. The moment the door opened behind her, Kelly straightened. She could feel his presence before he even spoke. Victor, in all his misguided glory, walking into her space as if he owned the building, as if he owned her. "I need those reports," he repeated, louder now, standing in her doorway. "You should have had them ready by now. You're wasting my time." Kelly's fingers paused over the keys. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, the only indication that something was shifting inside her. She exhaled quietly, and then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her chair to face him. She looked him dead in the eye, and for a brief moment, a spark of something dangerous flickered in her gaze. "I'm sorry. Did you say something?" she asked, her voice smooth and controlled, but with a hidden edge that he couldn't quite place. Victor stepped into the room, his confidence brimming, but the weight of Kelly's stare made him hesitate. "You don't seem to understand," she continued, her smile faint but chilling. "You don't control anything here, not yet." The silence that followed hung thick in the air. The storm was gathering. The days after that encounter with Victor passed slowly, but Kelly didn't allow herself to feel any sense of relief. It was an illusion to think that things would suddenly become easier. No, instead, she saw what was coming. More subtle insults, more disinterest, more silent mockery. It was all part of the game she knew too well, a game she had been playing her entire life. Kelly had learned early on to stay invisible, to be in the background, to observe, to gather power without drawing attention. She didn't need anyone to see her, but they had to see her now. They had no choice. Victor's words still echoed in her mind. "You're wasting my time." It was a reminder of the daily dehumanization she had endured in this place, and not just in this office. As a woman of color, every day was a battle, a fight to prove that she belonged, that she was more than the stereotype, more than the caricature people wanted her to be. But they always underestimated her. Always. Victor, on the other hand, had walked into this building with an arrogance that seemed to permeate the very air. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features and a polished look. Everything about him screamed power. He wore it like a crown, unaware of how fragile it was. He saw Kelly as just another face in the crowd, another cog in the machine to him. To everyone else in the office, she was the person who had been invisible for years. A black woman in a corner doing her work, not questioning the structure. But that corner was her kingdom. It was only a matter of time before everyone realized it. Every morning, Kelly came into the office at the same time, early. The building was still quiet, the workers still half asleep. She'd pass through the hallways without being noticed, slip into her seat without anyone acknowledging her presence. She knew they didn't care about her. Not really. Victor made sure of that. He'd pass her desk without a second glance, talking to his subordinates as though she were nothing. His tone would be sharp, dismissive. Kelly had seen it all before. How people like him walked around like they owned the place, treating everyone beneath them as if they were little more than air. But she wasn't air. She wasn't invisible. She just made sure they thought she was. One morning, however, as she was quietly reviewing some documents in her cubicle, she saw him again. Victor, the arrogant manager, was having one of his usual discussions with his team in the hallway, his booming voice carrying easily over the partitions. "I'm telling you, this place is a disaster. They don't have a single person who can actually think for themselves. It's all just a bunch of, what's the word I'm looking for? Half-wits mostly." He sneered, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for a reaction. Kelly's hand froze over her keyboard. She'd heard these kinds of comments before. She knew exactly what he meant. She'd heard it all her life. The underlying assumption that people of color, especially black women, were inferior, too dumb, too lazy, too incapable to ever truly achieve anything. The thinly veiled racism that clung to every corner of corporate America like a dark cloud. But she was more than used to it. She didn't flinch. Not anymore. Victor continued, oblivious to the woman sitting just a few feet away from him. "I don't know why they even bother hiring people like her. I mean, seriously, what good is she going to do? No offense, but I don't see her contributing much. She's probably just here because of some stupid diversity hire initiative." The words hit Kelly like a slap across the face, but she didn't react. Not yet. She remained calm, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. Victor's voice was getting louder now, mocking and dismissive, as if the words were meant to cut. The other employees in the hallway laughed, a few even chiming in with their own low murmurs. They all thought she couldn't hear them, that she wasn't paying attention. Kelly knew that Victor didn't just see her as a diversity hire. He saw her as a symbol of everything he resented about the world, a reminder that no matter how hard he worked, there would always be someone like her who didn't belong. Someone who had gotten in through different means, and it pissed him off. But what he didn't understand was that Kelly wasn't just a black woman in a corner. She was the one who had built the corner. She was the one who controlled the entire company from the shadows. He had no idea what she was capable of. No idea that she had the power to ruin him with a single phone call. As the laughter died down, Kelly stood up slowly from her desk, her movements deliberate. She walked down the hallway, heading straight for the elevator. The clicking of her heels echoed in the empty space. No one bothered to acknowledge her. No one but Victor, who was still standing there, obliviously mocking her. He saw her approaching out of the corner of his eye, his expression unchanged. It wasn't until she was right in front of him that he finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You're really going to walk right past me, huh?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "You know, for a second there, I thought you were going to speak up. I mean, come on, we both know you're just here to fill a quota, right?" The air in the hallway grew thick with tension. Kelly didn't say a word. She simply stood there, her eyes locked onto his. She could feel the eyes of the others on her, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to break. But Kelly didn't break. Not this time. Instead, she smiled. A smile so cold it could freeze the air between them. "You don't know who I am," she said quietly, her voice low, but filled with a quiet strength that made Victor pause. His smirk faltered, and for the first time, he seemed to realize that something was wrong. The other employees behind him stood silent, sensing that something was off. "I don't need to explain myself to you," Kelly continued, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "But you will learn who I am soon enough." She turned without another word, stepping into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft ding, and Victor stood frozen, watching as she disappeared from view. Back in her office, Kelly took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She could feel the anger inside her starting to boil over, but she forced it down. There was no room for that, not yet. The time would come when the storm would hit, and when it did, it would tear everything apart. But for now, she had to bide her time. And Victor was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the tension between Kelly and Victor only grew. He became more insufferable, more aggressive in his attempts to belittle her. He'd find reasons to criticize her work, to nitpick the smallest details, all while trying to act like he was above her. The other employees continued to watch, some of them too scared to speak up, others too indifferent to care. But Kelly wasn't concerned with them. Her focus was on Victor. She could feel the power slipping away from him, piece by piece, and it thrilled her. Each insult, each slight, each moment of cruelty. It was a gift. She was collecting them all, preparing for the moment when she would make him regret every word he had ever spoken. One day, a few weeks later, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Kelly had received an email from the corporate board. Her company, the one she had built from the ground up, was facing a significant financial setback. It wasn't much, just a small downturn in profits, but it was enough for her to know exactly what she needed to do, and so she waited. Victor, still unaware of the storm that was building just behind the scenes, walked into his office that morning, his smile wide and carefree. He hadn't realized that his days of unchecked arrogance were numbered. But he would soon. Kelly, hidden in plain sight, would make sure of it. And when the time came, when the walls finally came crashing down, Victor would learn that it was never the loudest voice that commanded power. It was always the quiet ones, the ones who stayed in the shadows. And Kelly had been in the shadows for far too long. The days stretched into weeks, and the atmosphere in the office became more suffocating with each passing day. The tension between Kelly and Victor was palpable, an unspoken battle, one that few noticed, but which had taken root deep within the walls of the corporate building. Kelly was no longer the invisible woman in the corner. She had become a presence, a shadow haunting every room, every conversation. And Victor, well, he had become her prey. Victor didn't understand what was happening. He couldn't see beyond his own reflection in the mirror of self-importance, couldn't grasp the sheer power of his ignorance. Every day he made his rounds, strutting through the office with that same self-assured swagger. But each encounter with Kelly left a slight mark on him, a crack in his armor, small at first, but growing more pronounced with time. It had started with casual slights, little comments that seemed harmless, but Kelly knew better. She had been around long enough to recognize the patterns. She had seen how the smallest injustices, the smallest dismissals, could fester into something far more dangerous. And she had learned, over the years, to turn that simmering anger into something she could use. On a particularly chilly Wednesday morning, the office was quieter than usual. The usual chatter was replaced by the soft tap of keyboards and the distant hum of printers. Kelly was sitting at her desk, sipping coffee, when Victor walked past her, as usual, without so much as a glance. He did, however, throw a comment over his shoulder, loud enough for several of the nearby employees to hear. "You really should pick up the pace, Kelly. I don't know how much longer you can afford to hide behind your excuses," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Kelly's hand tightened around her mug, but she didn't let herself react. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to provoke her, to make her react, to show weakness. But Kelly had learned that strength lay in silence. Her power came from staying calm, from holding her ground in the face of his taunts. Victor had no idea that his words meant nothing. He thought he was winning, thought he could control her with these insults, but he was wrong. The next day, Kelly found herself sitting in the break room, reading over some reports, when she overheard a conversation between two employees standing near the coffee machine. Their voices were low, but not low enough. "I heard Victor's been talking about her behind her back," one of them whispered. "He says she's not even qualified to be here. Just some diversity hire." The other employee laughed quietly. "Yeah, I don't know how she made it so far. But it's not like she's done anything impressive, right? She just keeps to herself and stays in her corner." Kelly remained perfectly still, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She could feel the sting of the words, but she didn't let it show. The remarks were meant to degrade her, to reduce her to a token. They wanted to make her feel small. But Kelly had long ago stopped caring what they thought. She had worked her entire life to get to this point, and she would not let the likes of them erase that. The truth was, Victor's attempts to undermine her were becoming more desperate. His words were sharper now, his attempts to belittle her more frequent. It wasn't just the insults anymore. Now, it was the way he treated her like she didn't belong, like she was somehow inferior. He'd give her meaningless tasks, things that anyone could do just to make her feel small. And when she did them perfectly, because she always did, he'd act as if it was expected, as if she had somehow just done what was required of her, like she didn't deserve credit for the work. But Kelly knew what he was doing. She knew that he was trying to break her, to strip her of her dignity, to make her feel less than. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about power, control. And Victor was not in control. He was about to learn just how far Kelly's influence stretched. Then, the moment came. It arrived when Kelly least expected it, but at the same time, exactly when she needed it. It was late afternoon, and most of the office was preparing to leave. Kelly was still at her desk, reviewing some figures for an upcoming meeting. She heard footsteps approaching, and without turning around, she knew it was him. Victor stopped at her desk. His presence loomed over her like a storm cloud, the oppressive weight of his arrogance pressing down. Kelly could feel the heat radiating from his body, his anger and impatience palpable. "What are you doing here so late?" he sneered, his voice filled with mock surprise. "Not that I care, but shouldn't you be on your way out by now?" Kelly didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge the comment. She just kept typing, her fingers moving fluidly over the keyboard, like she was in complete control of the situation. She could feel the tension mounting in the air. She could hear his breath, hear the frustration building inside him. Victor cleared his throat. "Well, if you're going to stick around, I need you to do something for me." Kelly's fingers paused, but she still didn't look up. "What is it?" "I need those financial reports you've been working on, the ones you've been holding back," he said, his voice tinged with impatience. "I expect them on my desk first thing in the morning." "Got it." Kelly sat back in her chair and finally turned to face him. She looked up at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. Her expression was calm, unreadable. There was no anger in her eyes, but there was something far worse, a quiet, unshakable confidence. "I already finished the reports," she said quietly. "They're on your desk." Victor's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. He had assumed she would drag her feet, that she would still be working on them. But no, she was already ahead of him. She had anticipated his every move, and now she was one step ahead. For a moment, Victor didn't speak. His mind raced, trying to process the unexpected turn of events. He didn't like feeling this way. He didn't like the fact that Kelly had outsmarted him. And in that moment, something shifted. The mask of superiority he had worn so confidently began to crack. But Kelly wasn't done. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the first real crack in his armor. And she pressed the advantage. "You know, Victor," she said, her voice still calm, but now tinged with something sharp. "I'm not the one you should be worried about. You're not even close to being the smartest person in this building, and you've never been the most powerful." Victor stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He opened his mouth to say something, but Kelly spoke first. "You've been trying to break me, trying to make me feel small. But you're not the one who has the power here. You're not the one who's in control. You never were." Victor opened his mouth again, but Kelly stood, slowly and deliberately, her eyes never leaving his. "I've been the one running this company all along, Victor. The real question is, how long are you going to keep pretending you're in charge?" The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. The realization came crashing down on him all at once. Kelly, the woman he had belittled and dismissed, was more than he could ever comprehend. She had been the one pulling the strings. She had been the one running the show behind the scenes, all while he played his little games, mocking her, thinking he was in control. And now, it was too late. Kelly turned and walked toward the door, leaving Victor standing there, frozen in place. The storm had arrived. And this time, Victor wasn't going to survive it. The walls he had built, the arrogance he had worn so proudly, were nothing more than dust. Kelly had already won. The game was over. And Victor had never even seen it coming. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy these tales, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next part. Now let's continue. The day after Kelly's confrontation with Victor, the office buzzed with a strange kind of energy. Whispers flew around the building like wildfire, though no one dared speak her name directly. The subtle shifts, the cracks in Victor's facade, hadn't gone unnoticed. People began to murmur, to question things they had previously accepted. It wasn't just Kelly's quiet confidence or her calm demeanor that made her stand out. It was her power, the kind of power that didn't need to be flaunted, the kind of power that lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. Victor, on the other hand, was unraveling. It was small at first, imperceptible to anyone except those who were paying attention. His usual strut, the way he walked through the office with an air of superiority, was gone. Now he seemed to shuffle from meeting to meeting, his sharp words losing their bite, his anger simmering just below the surface. Every time he crossed paths with Kelly, it was like stepping into the shadow of something larger, something he couldn't understand but desperately feared. The other employees, once indifferent, began to take note. Some, like Maria, a receptionist who had always been friendly but distant, started to look at Kelly with new eyes. They saw what she was capable of, and though they didn't know the whole story, they knew enough to understand that Kelly was not the person they had once thought her to be. The tension was palpable. Victor was used to getting what he wanted, to commanding attention in the room. He was used to throwing around his authority like it was his birthright. But now, as he watched Kelly move through the office with an almost unnatural calm, it ate at him. The truth had begun to settle in. He wasn't in control. He never had been. Kelly's position in the company was one of unspoken influence. Most people didn't know that she had quietly taken over every key position, every major decision that mattered. She had put the pieces in place, waited for the right moment. But now, as Victor's behavior became more erratic, it was becoming clear that the moment had come. It wasn't just his behavior toward her that was deteriorating. His relationships with other colleagues were starting to suffer. More and more, he was alienating himself. His attempts to belittle Kelly only made him seem petty. He'd criticize her in front of others, calling her ineffective, unqualified, the token hire, all the usual lines. But each time, it only made him look weaker. The words bounced off Kelly like water off stone. She didn't flinch. She knew exactly what he was doing. But one morning, the situation came to a head. Kelly was in her office, reviewing some documents, when the door slammed open. Victor stood there, breathing heavily, his face red with anger. His fists were clenched at his sides, the tension in his jaw almost palpable. "I've had enough of your games, Kelly," he said through gritted teeth. "Enough of you hiding behind your little facade. It's time you realized your place here." Kelly didn't look up from the papers. "I don't hide, Victor. I'm not the one playing games here." Victor's face twisted with frustration. "Don't give me that. You've been manipulating everything, haven't you? You think I don't see it? You think I don't know what you've been doing behind the scenes?" At this, Kelly finally set down the papers and met his gaze. Her eyes were calm, calculating. She had been expecting this moment for weeks. "You have no idea what I'm capable of," she said softly. But there was a cold edge to her voice that made Victor step back, even if just slightly. "You think you can just walk around, do whatever you want, and no one will notice? You think you're above all of this?" He was shouting now, his voice rising with every word. Kelly didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, her expression still impassive. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thickening with each passing second. Victor had always prided himself on his ability to intimidate, to assert dominance with his presence alone. But now, standing in front of Kelly, it was clear that he had met someone who wasn't afraid of him. "You're nothing more than a puppet in a game you don't even understand," Kelly finally said. Her voice was ice cold, and her words cut through the tension like a knife. "You think you control everything here, but you don't. You never did." Victor's hands shook with rage. He took a step toward her, his eyes burning with fury. "You don't deserve to be here," he spat. "You were a mistake, a token. That's all you'll ever be." It was the kind of comment Victor had made countless times before. The kind of comment he thought was harmless, a throwaway insult. But this time, something shifted in Kelly's eyes. Something dangerous. Something that Victor hadn't expected. Kelly stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, controlled. She took a step toward him, closing the space between them, until they were mere inches apart. Her gaze never wavered. "I didn't get here because of you, Victor. And I certainly didn't get here because of your approval," she said, her voice low and filled with a quiet fury that made his heart race. "I've built this company from the ground up. You're nothing but a footnote in my story, and I'm done letting you think you can control me." For a long moment there was silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the air itself knew that something had shifted irrevocably. Victor's chest heaved with anger, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. He could feel it, the realization that he was no longer in charge, that Kelly was not the weak, invisible woman he had once thought her to be. "I'm done with this," Kelly said finally, breaking the silence. "And so are you." Victor opened his mouth to say something, but Kelly was already walking past him. She didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing him beg, didn't allow him the moment of victory that he so desperately wanted. She had already won. Kelly's next move was swift, precise. She called the boardroom, requested an emergency meeting, and by the time Victor had gathered his thoughts and tried to regain control, it was too late. The board had already been informed. The moment he walked into that meeting, he knew it was over. In front of the entire board, Kelly revealed everything: how she had built the company, how Victor had been a figurehead, how he had failed in his role to understand the workings of the very company he had been hired to lead. It was a calculated strike, and it hit him harder than anything he could have imagined. The board members, many of whom had silently supported Kelly behind the scenes, began to shift their loyalties in real time. Victor, once so sure of himself, suddenly found himself on the outside looking in. The board voted swiftly, decisively. It was unanimous. Victor was fired. The shock on his face was almost comical. He couldn't believe it. 1 minute, he was the man in charge. The next, he was nothing. He stood there in stunned silence as Kelly calmly took her place at the head of the table. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. The board looked at her with respect, not because she was a woman of color, not because she was some token hire, but because she had proven herself to be more competent, more capable than anyone else in that room. She had built an empire without anyone even realizing it. Victor, standing in the doorway, tried to make one last stand. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Kelly raised her hand. "Leave," she said, her voice cold and final. "And never come back." With that, Victor turned and walked out. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was gone in an instant. And as Kelly watched him leave, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The battle was over, and she had won. It wasn't about the title. It wasn't about the power. It was about something deeper, something that Victor could never understand. For Kelly, it was the satisfaction of knowing that no matter how many obstacles life threw her way, she would always rise. Always. The office had become a different place in the wake of Victor's dismissal. What had once been a buzzing hive of whispered secrets, quiet ambitions, and subtle betrayals, now felt oddly still. The heavy cloud of tension that had hung over Kelly, the constant low-level pressure of being underestimated, of being a token, had evaporated. The air felt lighter, but with that came something else, an ominous quiet, as if the calm before a storm. Kelly walked through the halls of the corporate headquarters as the new CEO, her steps sure, measured, and resolute. She wasn't the invisible worker anymore. The shadows had been cast off. She had taken the seat of power she'd quietly earned for years. The transformation was complete. But there was one thing Kelly knew all too well. Victor's departure didn't mean the battle was over. It only marked the beginning of something bigger. The world had seen her as nothing but a diversity hire, an outsider who didn't belong in the high towers of corporate power. Now, the true fight would begin. The fight to dismantle the deep-seated prejudices, the silent racism that had permeated every inch of this company, and the fight to take what was rightfully hers, piece by piece. Her first morning as CEO felt like a strange kind of victory. When she walked into the building, she was met with hesitant glances, some filled with uncertainty, some with admiration, and others with barely disguised contempt. The faces were all too familiar. The same people who had dismissed her, who had whispered behind her back, who had insulted her silently and loudly, believing that her presence was a fluke, a mere statistical error in the corporate machine. They were too comfortable in their ignorance to see how deeply their own actions had perpetuated a system of exclusion, how little they understood the power dynamics that Kelly had mastered in silence. The news of Victor's sudden removal had spread like wildfire through the office. There was shock, confusion, and in some corners, even a sense of disbelief. But for Kelly, it was just another chapter in the long book of her struggle to prove that she belonged here. Kelly sat in her new office, the walls lined with sleek, modern decor that exuded power and authority. She stared out the window, her gaze far off, but her mind was already working on the next steps. The company was hers now, but there was no time for relaxation. She had to turn this place upside down, expose the deep-seated biases that festered just beneath the surface. The people here needed to understand that their perceptions of her had been wrong. They had built an empire on racism, on discrimination, and on silent prejudice. And now it was time for them to face the consequences. Her first move was a meeting with the department heads. She had called for a strategy session, and the air was thick with anticipation. The people who had once brushed her aside, who had snubbed her, who had thought she wasn't worthy of their time, would now sit across from her, forced to listen. As she walked into the conference room, all eyes turned to her. The room fell silent. Kelly was no longer just a woman of color trying to prove herself. She was the CEO, the one who had made decisions behind closed doors, who had quietly built this company into the powerhouse it had become. But the shift wasn't just about power. It was about dismantling a system that had been designed to exclude her and others like her. "Good morning," Kelly said, her voice calm, cool, and authoritative. "I'm sure you've heard the news by now. Victor is gone, and I am your new CEO. This company is mine now, and we are going to take it in a new direction. We're going to make sure that this place isn't just about profits and growth. It's about equity, diversity, inclusion, the things we've been pretending to care about for far too long." The department heads exchanged glances. They had always tolerated the rhetoric of diversity, of inclusion, but most of them had treated it like an afterthought, an HR checkbox to be ticked off so they wouldn't be exposed. Now, Kelly was staring them in the face, her words cutting through the pretensions like a hot knife through butter. "I know what you've all been thinking," Kelly continued, her eyes scanning the room. "You thought I was just here to fill a quota. You thought I didn't have the chops to lead. You saw me as nothing more than a diversity hire, a token. But now I'm the one in charge. And if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you get away with the things you've done, the things you've said, you're sorely mistaken." She paused, letting her words settle into the room. She could feel the tension, the palpable discomfort hanging in the air, and it fueled her. For years, she had been forced to accept the low expectations people had for her. But she had fought for this moment. And now, she was going to make sure they knew exactly who she was. "I know what Victor said about me behind my back. I know the whispers you've all participated in," Kelly continued. "I know how some of you have laughed at my expense, thinking that I was nothing but a stepping stone, a token to make your diversity numbers look good. I know you've questioned my qualifications, doubted my ability, and dismissed my intelligence. You've belittled me because of my race, because of my gender, and because you thought you could get away with it." A murmur rippled through the room. Some faces flushed, others remained stone-faced, but none could look Kelly in the eye without a flicker of guilt, of fear. Kelly was no longer that invisible woman in the corner. She was the one holding the reins now, and she could see how their discomfort mirrored their complicity in the system that had tried to silence her. "We're going to start making real changes," Kelly said. "No more tolerating racism in this building. No more pretending that we're committed to diversity when we're not. No more giving power to people who only seek to perpetuate the status quo. We're going to clean house, starting with the top." There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of weakness. Kelly had come to realize that nothing was more dangerous than complacency, the quiet acceptance of the systems that oppressed people like her. For years, she had played by their rules, kept her head down, and worked tirelessly. But no more. It was time for the tide to turn. "I know this won't be easy," Kelly said, her tone softening for the first time. "But I don't care. I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to change this company, to make it a place where everyone, regardless of their race, their gender, their background, has a chance to succeed. And if you don't like that, if you don't want to be part of that change, you can leave. I'll show you the door." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Kelly's words settling heavily on the department heads. Some of them shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, clearly rattled by the directness of her approach. Others seemed to be trying to calculate their next move, unsure of how to respond. One of the senior executives, Thomas, a tall man in his late 40s with a greying beard and a suit that seemed just a little too sharp for his personality, cleared his throat. "You're being quite bold," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of disbelief and challenge. "You think we're all just going to change overnight?" Kelly smiled, her expression tight. "I don't expect change overnight, but I expect it, and I expect you to start holding yourselves accountable for the things you've said and done, the things you've allowed to fester in this company for far too long." The room was silent again. The moment stretched on, thick with uncertainty. But Kelly could feel the shift. The power had already changed hands. She wasn't just talking to them, she was showing them. She was teaching them what it meant to be held accountable. One by one, the department heads began to speak. Some of them tried to argue, to push back, but their words faltered under Kelly's unwavering gaze. Others, more reluctant to challenge her, simply nodded, their resistance fading with each passing second. There were no real threats. There was no shouting or grand gestures, but Kelly's presence, her calm authority, was enough. By the end of the meeting, the new direction for the company was set. It was clear now that Kelly was not just a CEO in name. She was the one pulling the strings, the one making the decisions. And anyone who thought otherwise would soon be proven wrong. The reckoning had begun. And Kelly wasn't going to stop until every last vestige of racism, every last drop of prejudice, had been eradicated from this place. The fight was far from over, but Kelly was prepared. She had fought her whole life to get here. Now, it was time for everyone else to learn what true power really looked like, and they would learn, one way or another. The office had fallen into a tense stillness, like the calm that follows the first crash of thunder before the storm truly hits. The weight of Kelly's words lingered in the air long after the department heads had dispersed, each of them retreating to their respective corners of the building, no doubt questioning what had just transpired. Kelly's first day as CEO had been nothing short of a statement, an unequivocal declaration that she was here to change the game. And change it she would. But change, as she knew well, came at a cost. She had started by taking the first step toward dismantling the system that had held her, and countless others, down for so long. And in that moment, the true battle was about to unfold. The battle to reclaim not just her place at the table, but to eradicate the systemic racism that had been silently tolerated for decades. Kelly knew that Victor's departure wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a war that would force everyone in this company to confront their biases, their privileges, and their prejudices. But as she sat at her desk, going over the notes from the meeting, she felt the weight of the task ahead settle on her shoulders. The quiet whispers of dissent that had plagued her for so long weren't going to disappear with a few words in a boardroom. They would continue to fester, to grow louder, until she confronted them head-on. And confront them she would. The next few weeks were marked by a series of strategic moves. Kelly didn't rush the changes. She knew better than to expect overnight transformation. She had learned that power, once seized, had to be wielded carefully. She began with the quiet reshuffling of the company's key positions, removing individuals who had silently perpetuated a toxic culture, replacing them with those who shared her vision of inclusion and equity. But it was the quieter, more insidious forms of resistance that Kelly was most focused on. The whispered comments in the halls, the looks of contempt that would flash across faces when she passed by, the casual racism that still lingered in the office's undercurrent, unspoken but ever present. But Kelly was ready. She had come prepared for this fight, and she wasn't going to back down. One afternoon, Kelly found herself walking through the open-plan office floor, the click of her heels reverberating on the polished floor. The employees were absorbed in their work, but there was an underlying tension in the air. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a confrontation. Kelly could sense it. People were watching her, some with curiosity, some with disdain, and others with something deeper, something more dangerous: fear. As she passed by a row of desks, a conversation caught her attention. It was hushed, but the words were clear enough. "I can't believe they put her in charge," one voice said, dripping with disdain. Kelly knew the voice. Brandon, a senior executive who had been with the company for over 15 years. He had been one of the first to dismiss her, to belittle her. He was a man who never thought he would see the day when someone like Kelly, someone black and female, would occupy the role of CEO. "She's just a diversity hire, that's all. It's a joke. She has no idea what she's doing," Brandon continued, his voice thick with arrogance. Kelly stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. Her instinct told her to confront him right then and there, to rip away the mask of civility he wore so proudly. But she held herself back. She wasn't going to let him win that easily. Not today. Not ever. Instead, she turned around and quietly walked back to her office, closing the door behind her. Her mind raced, the conversation echoing in her ears. It wasn't just Brandon. It was the culture that had built this company on the backs of people like her, all while silently undermining them. She wasn't naive enough to think that one speech, one shake-up could fix it all, but she wasn't going to stop until it did. Kelly sat at her desk, her fingers gripping the edge, staring at the window before her. She could feel the weight of her decision to confront this toxic culture pressing down on her. It wasn't just about reshuffling the board, bringing in new people, or making grand speeches in front of the employees. It was about breaking down the walls that had been built up over decades. Walls that allowed people like Brandon to hold positions of power, to perpetuate their ignorance and their hatred without consequence. And it would take more than a few meetings to tear those walls down. That evening, Kelly made a decision. It was time to confront the employees who still refused to see her as anything more than a token. It was time to show them that she wouldn't tolerate the whispers, the backhanded compliments, the racial microaggressions any longer. She called for a town hall meeting, and for the first time since taking office, she would address the entire company. The next morning, the town hall was set. Employees filed into the large conference room, murmuring among themselves. Kelly stood at the front of the room, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, others hostile. They had no idea what was coming. When the room fell silent, Kelly took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "I've heard your whispers," she began, her voice steady, but laced with a quiet anger. "I've heard the comments, the jokes, the assumptions about me, about who I am and why I'm here. I've heard every single one of you who thinks I don't belong in this room. And I want to make one thing clear. I don't need your permission. I don't need your approval. I'm here because I earned my place here, and I'll be damned if any of you think you can diminish my worth." The room was deathly quiet. For a moment, Kelly thought she might hear a few gasps of disbelief, but instead, there was only silence. It was the kind of silence that followed the unraveling of a lie. "You want to talk about diversity hires?" Kelly continued, her eyes narrowing, locking on specific individuals in the room. "You want to pretend that I'm here because of some quota? Let me tell you something. Those quotas, they exist because people like you, people who look at me and think I don't belong, have created a system where people like me are systematically excluded from opportunities. And I'm here to tell you that I'm done playing by those rules." Kelly paused, allowing her words to settle into the room. She could see the shock on their faces, the disbelief as they processed what she was saying. But this wasn't about making them feel comfortable. This was about making them see the truth. "I know some of you," Kelly said, her voice now sharp and pointed. "I know that there are people in this room who have belittled me behind my back. I know that there are people in this room who have referred to me as a token. I know that you think I don't belong. But I'm telling you right now, if you can't respect me for the work I've done, if you can't respect me for the person I am, then you're the problem, not me. And this company, under my leadership, is not going to be a place where that kind of thinking is tolerated." Brandon's face turned bright red, but he stayed silent, a bead of sweat running down his temple. Kelly could feel his eyes burning into her, but she didn't flinch. This was just the beginning. The reckoning had come, and it would be thorough. "You see," Kelly continued, "this isn't just about me. This is about every single person who has been held back, who has been underestimated, who has been written off as just another diversity hire. And you're going to have to face the fact that this company's success is going to come from the work of people who look like me, people who have fought for every single inch of progress they've made. People who have been overlooked because of the color of their skin or the gender they were born into." The room was still, but there was a shift. Some of the employees, the ones who'd been too afraid to speak out, began to nod slowly. They were hearing her. And for the first time, Kelly realized that the company wasn't as unified as it had once seemed. There was a divide, one that had been hiding in plain sight. "This is your choice," Kelly concluded. "You can choose to be part of the change, or you can choose to leave. But know this, if you stay, you will be held accountable. We will not tolerate ignorance. We will not tolerate racism. And we will not tolerate anyone who thinks that the only reason I'm standing here is because of some arbitrary quota. I am here because I am the best person for this job. And if you don't like it, there's the door." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "And I will make sure you won't have to wait long to leave." Kelly turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. A silence that would mark the beginning of the end for the old company and the rise of something new, something stronger, something better. The storm had arrived. And this time, it wasn't just a passing storm. It was a reckoning, and Kelly was ready to watch everything that had once held her back burn to the ground. The aftermath of Kelly's town hall reverberated through every corridor of the company, like the aftershocks of an earthquake. It wasn't just the employees who felt the tremors. Those who had been silently harboring resentment, those who had dismissed her and belittled her in countless ways, were now forced to confront the reality of their situation. Kelly was not a placeholder, not a diversity hire to be quietly tolerated until her tenure ran its course. No, she was a force to be reckoned with, and it was becoming clear to everyone that they had underestimated her. The few who had not been entirely cowed in the meeting began to rally together, speaking in hushed tones in the break rooms, in the hallways, behind closed doors. They had all been on the same side for so long, connected by the silent, unspoken agreement that Kelly, as a woman of colour, was only a temporary figurehead. They had assumed she would falter, make mistakes, and eventually expose her true incompetence. But as each day passed, Kelly's decisions grew more measured, her authority more solidified. The murmurs of dissent had not stopped. In fact, they had only grown louder. Kelly could feel it all around her, the passive-aggressive comments that still slipped out behind her back, the glances of contempt as she walked through the hallways. But it was no longer enough to simply acknowledge it. She had to confront it head-on. As CEO, Kelly was aware of the stark contrast between what was publicly said and what was privately believed. It was as if the entire corporate structure was built on a lie that perpetuated itself by insisting that people like her, people from backgrounds like hers, couldn't possibly succeed without some sort of artificial help. It was a racist myth that had been woven into the fabric of the company over years. A myth that no one dared question, because doing so would mean facing the uncomfortable truth about their own biases. But Kelly wasn't afraid of the truth. In fact, it was the one thing she had always held close to her chest. The truth had driven her forward when she was a young girl. The truth had been her weapon when she was overlooked for promotions. And the truth had become the very thing she wielded with unmatched precision now. She wasn't here by accident. She had earned this position with blood, sweat, and determination. And she wasn't about to let anyone strip that away. It had been weeks since the town hall, and yet the atmosphere in the office had become even more charged. People were beginning to make their choices. Some had already left, unable to stomach the transformation Kelly was bringing. Others had stayed, but it was clear they were waiting for something. Waiting for her to slip up. Waiting for her to show that she was just a token after all. But Kelly had no intention of showing weakness. Not now. Not ever. It was one late afternoon when the next confrontation arrived, this time, with someone more powerful than anyone had anticipated. Brandon, the senior executive who had openly mocked her at the beginning of her tenure, decided that enough was enough. He had been too silent, too compliant for too long, and he wasn't going to stand by while Kelly continued to rewrite the rules of the company. Brandon called for a private meeting. It wasn't uncommon for employees to request one-on-ones with Kelly, but this time there was an edge to it. Kelly could feel the tension long before Brandon walked into her office, his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched tight. "Kelly," he said, his tone cold as he entered without knocking, "we need to talk." Kelly didn't rise from her desk. She remained seated, her eyes fixed on him. She had been expecting this moment, and now the confrontation had arrived. "What's this about, Brandon?" Kelly asked, her voice calm and measured, despite the feeling of rising anger that stirred in her gut. "You've made your point, haven't you?" Brandon continued, his words dripping with contempt. "You've shaken things up, but this company was built by people like me, people who worked hard, who put in the hours, people who didn't need to play the race card to get ahead." Kelly's lips parted slightly, her hands resting calmly on the desk in front of her. She could feel the simmering hatred behind his words, the years of resentment that had built up in him, waiting for the right moment to surface. "Let's get one thing straight," Kelly said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This company was built on the backs of people like me, too. People who were ignored, underestimated, and forced to work twice as hard to prove they belonged. And I'm here because I earned my place, not because of a quota, not because of diversity initiatives, but because I've done the work you couldn't even begin to understand." Brandon's face flushed a deep red, his anger flaring in his eyes. "You think you can just change everything overnight?" he spat. "You think we're all going to just sit back and watch while you tear this place apart?" Kelly stood up slowly, walking around the desk toward him. She was calm, her movements deliberate, but there was a sense of finality in the air. "I didn't tear anything apart," Kelly said softly. "I'm rebuilding it. I'm building a company where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, has an equal shot. A company where people like me, people who have always been silenced, no longer have to hide in the shadows." Brandon's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his posture now intimidating, but Kelly stood her ground. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "You'll never be one of us. You'll never fit in here. People like you don't belong in leadership roles. You're an outsider. And no matter how hard you try to change things, you'll never change the fact that you're not like us." Kelly took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. His words were meant to wound, meant to break her down. He thought they would. He thought that this was the final push he needed to break her spirit. But Kelly had faced much worse in her life. She had been told she didn't belong, that she was nothing more than a statistic. It had never been true, and it was still a lie. "You're wrong," she said simply. "I'm exactly where I belong." With that, Kelly turned her back to him and walked to the window, her gaze sweeping over the skyline. The company was hers now, and the changes would keep coming, no matter how much resistance they faced. The work she was doing was not just about rebuilding the company's bottom line. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed people like Brandon to thrive in the first place. The kind of system that had encouraged others like him to believe they were untouchable, that their words, no matter how vile, had no consequence. "You'll learn soon enough," Kelly continued, her back still turned. "The world is changing, and you're either going to change with it, or you're going to be left behind." Brandon, still seething with fury, took a step toward her. "You think you can just dismiss me? You think you're untouchable? We're not done here, Kelly. You'll see." Kelly turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. "I don't need to dismiss you, Brandon. You're already dismissed. You just don't realize it yet." Without another word, she walked to the door and opened it, motioning for him to leave. Brandon stood there for a moment, his pride wounded, his face red with anger. But he knew he had lost this battle. He knew that Kelly was not a woman who could be bullied, who could be pushed into submission, and deep down, he knew that his time at the company was quickly running out. He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him, and Kelly stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. She had won this round, but she knew there would be more battles to come. There were always more battles. And as she turned back to her desk, she smiled. This was just the beginning, and she was ready. The days following Brandon's outburst were tense, like the eerie silence after the first crack of lightning. Kelly was aware that her actions had set off a chain reaction within the company. The ripples of her confrontation with Brandon had spread, slowly but surely, through the offices and boardrooms. It was no longer just about her. It was about the very structure of the company, its history, its culture, and its unspoken rules. And the people who had spent years sitting comfortably at the top, looking down on everyone else, were starting to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. Despite her victory in the one-on-one with Brandon, Kelly knew it wasn't going to be easy. The resistance she faced wasn't just from a few disgruntled individuals, it was systemic. There were employees who had been silently complicit in perpetuating a culture of exclusion and bias. They were the ones who had seen her as a threat and who now had to decide whether they would adapt or continue to resist. The next week was marked by subtle but increasingly hostile confrontations. Whispers behind closed doors, sidelong glances, and passive-aggressive comments had become commonplace. Kelly couldn't walk down a hallway without hearing someone talk about how unqualified she was or how things used to be better. These were not just isolated comments. They were the product of years of embedded discrimination. And now, as CEO, Kelly was the embodiment of everything they resented. One morning, Kelly was heading to the conference room for a meeting with the board when she overheard a conversation between two senior executives. She didn't recognize them at first, but their words were unmistakable. "I just don't get it," one of them said, a tone of confusion and bitterness in his voice. "She's only here because of diversity. She's never actually done anything to earn that spot. Kelly's stomach tightened. She had heard these types of comments before, derogatory, dismissive, meant to undermine her abilities. But hearing them from two executives, men who had worked in the company for decades, was a harsh reminder of the depth of the problem she was up against. We've worked our whole lives to get where we are, and now she just walks in and takes it. The second man responded, his voice laced with disgust. It's not right. I don't care what anyone says. She doesn't belong at the top. Kelly's hand gripped the doorknob of the conference room, but she didn't turn it. Instead, she took a deep breath, letting their words wash over her. There was no surprise, no shock. She had known that this kind of resistance would come, but hearing it out in the open, so brazenly, stung. Still, she wasn't going to let it break her. She stepped into the room with an air of calm confidence that even she didn't fully understand. The board members looked up from their papers, their faces a mixture of anticipation and wariness. Kelly was different now, stronger, more resolute. She had seen the reactions to her leadership, and she was prepared to confront them head-on. The meeting began with a discussion of the company's current performance, the usual metrics and data being thrown around the table. But Kelly was no longer just a passive observer. She had spent countless hours studying the figures, the trends, and the weaknesses in the company's operations. She had made bold moves to change the direction of the company, and the board was starting to see the results. But there was still one thing they didn't quite understand. "You've been making progress," one of the board members, Thomas, said cautiously, his voice measured. "But there's a concern. Some of our senior executives feel unsettled by the pace of change. They think it's happening too quickly." Kelly's eyes flicked to the faces around the table. She could feel the weight of their words, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she leaned forward, meeting Thomas's gaze. "Unsettled," Kelly repeated, her voice cold. "Unsettled by what? Progress? By fairness? By the fact that for once, we're doing something that isn't just about appeasing the people who've had power for decades." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Kelly's words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. She knew exactly what they were thinking. They were trying to appease the very people who had long believed they were entitled to control. But Kelly wasn't interested in appeasing anyone. Not anymore. "Let's be clear," Kelly continued, her voice growing firmer. "The changes I'm making aren't just about diversity. They're about creating a company that doesn't just succeed financially, but also operates with integrity. A company where people are treated equally, regardless of their race, gender, or background. A company where the very culture we've built, one that has silently tolerated bias and discrimination, is dismantled." She paused, letting her words settle into the room. The faces around the table were a mixture of discomfort and reluctant understanding. Kelly could see that they were struggling to reconcile the vision she was laying out with the way they had always operated. For them, the system had worked, or so they thought. "I'm not here to cater to anyone's delicate sensibilities," Kelly added, her voice unwavering. "I'm here to make sure this company becomes a place where people can thrive based on their talent, not based on the color of their skin or the gender they were born into. If that unsettles anyone, then I suggest they consider whether they truly belong here." The room fell silent once again, but this time there was a different kind of silence. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was thoughtful. They were beginning to see that Kelly was unyielding in her pursuit of change. She was no longer a pawn in their game. She was the one holding the pieces now, and she intended to use them to reshape the entire structure of the company. After a long, tense pause, Thomas finally spoke again. "We're not opposed to change, Kelly, but there are those who feel that this pace might be too much. We need to tread carefully." Kelly's gaze hardened. She was done with careful. She had been careful her entire life, bending to the expectations of those who didn't think she was good enough, who didn't think she belonged. Well, those days were over. "I'm not here to tread lightly," she said, her voice firm and decisive. "I'm here to burn down the walls that have been built over decades, and if anyone here isn't ready for that, then they're free to leave. This company is mine now, and I'm not looking back." The words hit the room like a bombshell. There was no more room for ambiguity. Kelly wasn't going to tiptoe around anyone's fragile egos. The board members, many of whom had been part of the old regime, now had to face the truth. They had to decide if they would follow her vision or continue to resist and risk losing everything. "I'm giving you a choice," Kelly continued. "Either you support what I'm doing or you leave. It's that simple." There was a long silence before one of the older members of the board, Richard, cleared his throat. "I don't think anyone here is saying we don't support progress, Kelly," he said carefully. "But the way you're going about it, well, it's causing more disruption than we anticipated." Kelly's lips curled into a cold smile. "Disruption is exactly what this company needs. If you can't handle it, then maybe you're not cut out for this anymore. It's time for this company to change, and it's going to change whether anyone likes it or not." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Kelly held up a hand, silencing him. She wasn't going to waste any more time on those who didn't understand the depth of the transformation she was leading. She had come too far to let anyone, even the board, slow her down. "Now," she said, standing up from her seat, her tone shifting to one of finality, "I expect you all to take this seriously. If there's any resistance left, it's time for it to be dealt with, and it will be dealt with swiftly." With that, Kelly turned on her heel and left the room, leaving the board members to stew in the aftermath of her words. She knew she had shaken them to their core, but it wasn't just the board she had to worry about. It was the entire company, and she had no illusions about the battle ahead. This was just the beginning. The following weeks saw a flurry of activity behind the scenes. Kelly took decisive action, removing those who were too entrenched in the old ways of thinking and replacing them with new leadership. People who shared her vision of a company that wasn't just about profit, but about real change. She implemented strict policies on inclusion, held mandatory training on unconscious bias, and made it clear to everyone, from entry-level employees to senior executives, that discrimination of any kind would not be tolerated. But even as the company slowly began to shift, Kelly knew that the real battle was still ahead. The culture of racism, the subtle microaggressions, the unspoken biases, these were not things that could be changed overnight. It was going to take time. But Kelly had the will, the resolve, and the power to see it through. And she wasn't about to stop until she had torn down every last vestige of the old, broken system that had sought to silence her. The war for this company's soul had only just begun, but Kelly was ready. Ready to fight, ready to win, and ready to make sure no one ever again doubted her place at the table. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. The once familiar faces of the company's senior leaders were now full of uncertainty, their eyes shifting between each other, trying to assess the damage Kelly had just inflicted. Her ultimatum had not only shaken them to their core, it had shattered the comfortable illusions they had lived with for so long. They had spent years at the top, benefiting from the implicit rules that kept people like Kelly out of positions of power. But now, in the wake of her unwavering leadership, those very rules were being dismantled. Kelly sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't here to make friends or to cater to their egos. She was here to break down the walls of an unjust system, one step at a time. And in that moment, it was clear to her, and to them, that nothing could stop her now. The boardroom had grown quieter since her last speech, each person digesting what she had said. It was a new reality for them, a reality in which their opinions, biases, and long-standing privileges no longer carried the weight they once did. The men and women who had gotten used to making decisions in the shadows of privilege now had to contend with the sharp light Kelly had cast on their actions. They could no longer simply dismiss her as a diversity hire or a figurehead. They had to reckon with the fact that she had been the one who had been steering the ship all along, quietly, strategically, and without their knowledge. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Richard, the older board member, spoke up, though his voice was strained. "Kelly, I understand your position, but we need to consider the bigger picture. This company, this industry, operates on long-established norms. Changing things too quickly could risk the stability of the entire operation. We have to be cautious, measured." Kelly's lips curved into a faint, tight smile. Cautious? Measured? She repeated, her voice low and steady. This company has been cautious for too long, too cautious with how it treats its employees, too cautious with how it deals with discrimination, too cautious with how it embraces diversity. This isn't about being careful anymore. This is about revolutionizing the entire way we do business, about making sure that people like me, people of color, don't just get the scraps from the table, but get a seat at the table. There was a murmur of discontent among the members, some shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, others exchanging looks that betrayed their underlying fear. But Kelly wasn't finished. She had reached the point of no return, and she wasn't going to let them derail her vision. You're right, Richard, Kelly continued. This company has been operating on norms that benefit a select few, while the rest of us, people like me, people who don't fit your preconceived notions, have had to fight tooth and nail just to be seen, just to be heard. Well, I'm not interested in maintaining those old systems anymore. I've made it clear that the company will be restructured, and we will no longer tolerate the undercurrent of racism, sexism, and exclusion that's been allowed to fester for years. And if you can't accept that, if you're not on board with the change I'm bringing, then there's the door. The tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just discomfort. It was fear. Fear that Kelly was not just speaking about change, she was actively making it happen. The rules had shifted, and now, if they wanted to remain in positions of power, they would have to play by Kelly's rules. They could no longer rely on their usual tactics of subtle sabotage, backroom deals, and dismissing the validity of those who didn't fit their mold. The game had changed, and it was only going to get harder for them from here on out. Across the room, Thomas, another senior executive, looked like he had swallowed something bitter. I don't think you fully understand the kind of pressure you're putting on this company, he said, his voice trembling slightly. It's one thing to talk about diversity initiatives, but it's another thing entirely to force these kinds of changes. You're alienating the people who have kept this company afloat for years. Kelly looked at him with a calm, almost disinterested expression. Alienating? She asked, her eyebrow raised. I'm not alienating anyone. I'm demanding accountability. For too long, people like you have been allowed to operate under the guise of competence, while dismissing anyone who doesn't look like you. What you call keeping the company afloat is actually upholding a broken system, one that has left countless people like me in the margins. But not anymore. She leaned forward slightly, her voice sharpening with intensity. The truth is, Thomas, I'm not alienating anyone. I'm forcing you all to confront the truth, something that's been long overdue. This company needs a wake-up call, and if you can't handle that, then maybe you're the ones who need to leave. There was no response. None of the board members knew how to argue with her. They couldn't deny the undeniable. Kelly was the leader now. She was the one calling the shots, and they were going to have to adapt to her way of thinking or be swept aside. For a long, agonizing silence, the room remained still. Then, one by one, the board members shifted in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances, some of them slowly nodding in reluctant agreement. They didn't have much choice. Kelly's words had hit too close to home. They knew, deep down, that the days of the old guard were over. The times had changed, and it was no longer enough to rely on outdated systems of power that excluded and discriminated. They were going to have to make a decision. Either they would adapt to Kelly's vision or find themselves left behind, replaced by people who truly understood what diversity and inclusion meant. When the meeting concluded, there was no grand applause, no sense of victory. Instead, there was a quiet resignation in the air, a shared understanding that the fight was far from over, but that Kelly had taken the first and most decisive step. She had won. But the true test, the battle that would define her legacy, was only just beginning. Over the next few weeks, Kelly's presence began to permeate every facet of the company. Her reforms were far-reaching and non-negotiable. She was everywhere, making herself known, meeting with employees, demanding changes in every department. No stone was left unturned. New hiring practices were introduced, and for the first time, people of color, women, and members of underrepresented groups were given not just opportunities, but the power to rise through the ranks, to lead, to become key decision makers. Kelly wasn't just talking about diversity, she was living it. She was putting people in positions of power who had never been given a chance, who had been told all their lives that they weren't good enough. But Kelly saw the potential in them. She saw the fire in their eyes, the same fire that had driven her to rise to the top against all odds. And she wasn't going to let that fire be extinguished by the prejudices of the past. But change, Kelly quickly realized, didn't come without a price. While many employees supported her vision, others, particularly those who had been part of the old regime, began to push back in more covert ways. The whispers behind closed doors grew louder. There were reports of employees leaving in anger, feeling alienated by the sweeping changes she had implemented. But Kelly wasn't fazed. The sacrifices were necessary. The system had to be torn down. She wasn't here to make people comfortable. She was here to make the world better. One afternoon, Kelly was walking through the office when she overheard a conversation between two employees at the water cooler. They were speaking in hushed tones, but the words were loud and clear. "She's ruining everything. We've worked for years to build this company, and now she's just throwing it all away," one of the employees said, bitterness thick in his voice. "I know. It's like she doesn't even care about what's made this place successful," the other employee replied. "She's just trying to make it all about diversity. But what about the rest of us? What about the people who've been here from the start?" Kelly stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. It was exactly what she had feared. The deep-seated resistance from those who refused to let go of the old ways. But instead of anger, a sense of resolve washed over her. This wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had been pushed aside, ignored, and made to feel like they weren't good enough. She turned toward the two men, who immediately stopped talking and froze, their eyes wide as they realized Kelly had overheard them. Kelly smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you truly think this is about ruining everything," she said softly, her voice cold, "then you haven't been paying attention. This is about creating a company where everyone has a fair chance to succeed, not just the ones who've been lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time." The two men stood silent, not knowing how to respond. "This company is mine now," Kelly continued, her gaze never wavering. "And if you don't like the changes I'm making, if you can't accept that we're moving forward, then perhaps it's time for you to find a new place that better suits your outdated ideals." She turned and walked away, leaving the two men standing there, their mouths open in stunned silence. Kelly knew that the battle was far from over. The resistance would continue. The whispers, the challenges, the quiet sabotage, it would all persist. But now, she was ready for it. The tide was turning, and there was no going back. The fight was hers to win, and she would win it. The weight of the changes Kelly had fought for, the battles she had fought and won, had begun to feel like the first moments of sunrise after a long, stormy night. There were still struggles, still resistance at every corner, but the landscape of the company had undeniably shifted. Her vision was no longer a dream, it was becoming reality. The foundation she had worked tirelessly to lay was beginning to take shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and for the first time in her life, Kelly felt that she was truly in control. She wasn't just a woman of color in a sea of white faces, she was the CEO, and she had earned her place. But as the dawn of her reign began, Kelly also knew the price she would pay would be steep. As the foundation shifted, there were those who had dug their heels into the ground, unwilling to let go of the old ways. The whisper campaigns continued, and now there were more public attempts to undermine her. The old guard hadn't just accepted the changes. They were actively fighting against them, doing everything they could to regain their grip on the company's power. There was one person in particular who had made it his mission to destroy Kelly. Brandon. The man who had started the quiet rebellion against her leadership, the one who had made his feelings about her very clear, had been quietly working behind the scenes, rallying supporters, sabotaging her progress at every opportunity. He had become the focal point for the resistance, and Kelly knew that if she was to fully break free of the old system, she would have to deal with him once and for all. It all came to a head during an executive meeting, a routine check-in that would change everything. Kelly sat at the head of the table, as always, poised and confident. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some in admiration, others in contempt. But she had grown used to it. She was no longer intimidated by their gazes, no longer uncertain of her place. She had earned this moment. But Brandon, with his ever-present air of superiority, wasn't willing to let her enjoy the victory. He had rallied a group of executives who still resented the changes she was bringing, and they were ready to strike. Brandon had gone so far as to orchestrate a plot to undermine Kelly, attempting to discredit her leadership, to make her seem unqualified, to cast doubt on the integrity of her decision-making. And this meeting was the culmination of his efforts. As the meeting began, Kelly could sense the tension in the room, the palpable sense of unrest. The quiet murmurs between Brandon and a few of the other executives didn't escape her notice. She had seen the signs before. The quiet sabotage, the whispers behind her back. But this time, she was ready. "Kelly," Brandon started, his voice dripping with feigned concern, "we need to talk about the direction you're taking this company. There are a number of us who are very concerned about the way things are going. The changes you've implemented, well, they've created a lot of unrest. You're alienating the people who have worked here for years, the people who actually know how this company functions." Kelly didn't flinch. She had heard these words before. She had dealt with people like Brandon her entire life. He was just another one of the privileged few who had built his success on the backs of those who were systematically overlooked, pushed aside, and ignored. "Brandon," she said, her voice firm but controlled, "it's clear to me that your concern isn't about the company's direction. It's about your position. You've spent so long clinging to the old ways, to a system that only served a select few, that you can't imagine a world where the rest of us, those who were excluded, actually have a chance to lead." The words hit Brandon like a slap. He could feel the weight of her accusation, the sting of his own privilege being stripped away in front of the entire room. For a moment, he faltered. But his ego, his need for control, wouldn't allow him to back down. "You don't get it, do you?" Brandon hissed, his voice rising with anger. "You don't belong here. This company was built by people like me. You've come in and turned everything upside down, and now everything is falling apart. You'll never be one of us. You'll always be an outsider, an imposter." Kelly's heart raced as she heard those words. She had been called an outsider her whole life, by classmates, by colleagues, by the very people who felt threatened by her existence. It wasn't new to her, but it hurt. It always hurt, no matter how many times she heard it. The idea that she would never belong, that no matter how hard she worked, how much she achieved, she would never be accepted. It was the ultimate form of degradation. But Kelly had learned long ago that the only way to survive, the only way to thrive, was to rise above it. To prove them all wrong, she stood up slowly, her eyes locking with Brandon's. "You're right about one thing," Kelly said, her voice steady, almost cold. "I'll never be one of you, and that's exactly the point. I don't need to be one of you. I don't need your approval. I don't need to fit into your outdated racist mold. I'm here because I deserve to be here. I'm here because I've worked harder, fought longer, and endured more than you'll ever understand." Brandon's face flushed red with anger. "You don't know what it's like," he sneered, "to have built something from the ground up, to have fought for your success. You've never had to work for it like I did. Everything you have has been handed to you on a silver platter, all because of some diversity quota. You didn't earn it." Kelly's eyes darkened, but her expression remained calm. She had spent years hearing this, hearing how she was only there because of some external factor, some arbitrary system that wasn't based on merit. She had heard the whispers, the accusations, and the belittling comments. She had endured it all, and now, as the final moment approached, she wasn't going to let it break her. "You want to talk about earning it," Kelly said, her voice gaining strength. "I've earned every inch of this. Every promotion, every opportunity, every step I've taken in this company has been fought for. And while you were busy trying to maintain a system that excluded people like me, I was quietly working to make sure I was more qualified than any of you. I didn't need a handout, Brandon. I didn't need a diversity quota. I needed determination. I needed resilience. And I had it. You, on the other hand, have spent your entire life coasting on the privilege of being white, of being a man in a system that's stacked in your favor. The room fell into an oppressive silence. Brandon's face twisted with rage, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though trying to steady himself. The other executives in the room looked on, unsure of how to respond. They had seen Kelly rise to the occasion time and time again, but they had never seen her this direct, this unyielding. Kelly's eyes narrowed as she looked at Brandon, her voice cutting through the silence. This company is changing, Brandon, whether you like it or not. And if you can't handle that, if you can't accept that your time at the top is over, then it's time for you to go. For a moment, Brandon stood there, seething with fury. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The power he had once held over the company was slipping away. Slowly, painfully, he was realizing that Kelly had become the true leader. "I'll give you one final chance to walk away with some dignity," Kelly said, her voice like ice. "Leave now, or stay and face the consequences." Brandon's mouth opened, but no words came out. He knew, deep down, that Kelly was right. He had lost. The battle he had waged against her had been futile, and for the first time in his life, he realized that his privilege, his entitlement, had no place in this new world Kelly was building. Without another word, Brandon turned and walked out of the room, leaving the company, leaving his position, his legacy, behind. The room was still. The silence was thick with the gravity of what had just occurred. But Kelly stood tall, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She had won, and now the company was truly hers. The fight had been long, and it had been brutal. But in the end, Kelly had proven that no matter how many times she was pushed down, no matter how many times they tried to silence her, she would rise. She had earned her place at the top, and she would never let anyone take it from her again. And as she walked out of the room, she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Thank you for following this story. We'd love to hear what you think about it. Have you experienced situations of racism in your own life? Or have you witnessed moments where people had to fight to prove their worth? Your thoughts and experiences are incredibly important to us, and we deeply value each and every one of you. Please consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment below. It helps us grow and continue creating these stories. We appreciate all your support. Have a great day, and if you've listened to the story all the way through, leave a comment with the phrase, "The fight is never over," so we know you've been with us until the end.